Good afternoon, and welcome to the first event in our Leadership webinar series, Healthcare Under Siege, hosted by the E&O Inatowicz Institute for Leadership at the Ivey Business School. My name is Gerard Seitz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute. Before I say a few words about the Institute, I would like to first offer a few important thanks. First, a thank you to our esteemed panelists. We can only imagine, as we are in the midst of this third wave, how precious and limited your time is. So thank you for joining us today and sharing with us your hard-won lessons about leadership in general and leader character in particular. We all look forward to hearing what you have to say. Second, our thanks to you, the audience. We warmly welcome all of you who tuned in today and are grateful for your curiosity about how the four exceptional leaders we have with us this afternoon relied on their leadership to meet the many challenges embedded in the COVID-19 pandemic. And third, I'd like to extend thanks to my Ivey colleagues, Kimberly Milani, Sarah McCabe, and our outstanding Ivey IT team members, Joe Rylett, Kevin Luton, and Gideon Gray. Putting the Leadership webinar series together is no small feat, and I want to ensure that today you, the audience, are aware of their dedication in putting together this outstanding event. The E&O Inatowicz Institute for Leadership was established in 2010 and is now at the forefront of research, teaching, and outreach on leader character. The COVID-19 pandemic spotlighted the need for effective leadership in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. Stories abound that reveal how the pandemic has brought out the best and worst in leaders. And if a crisis is a defining test of leader character, then not everyone has passed it. This is a major problem for organizations and the many stakeholders, and it indeed poses challenges for Canada's prosperity. In a minute, we'll hear from today's four thought leaders who have had to rely on their strength of character to meet myriad challenges, to perform in their roles, and to influence others to work through the pandemic. They will reflect on their hard-won leadership lessons, but also share their thoughts on the future of healthcare in Canada and the critical role of character-based leadership in rebuilding a broken system. I'm very confident they will share with us many insightful and valuable lessons that we all can carry forward. And so we do hope you will be inspired, enlightened, and invigorated. But of course, things should not end there. As you listen to today's conversation, I encourage you to reflect on the importance of leadership and character in particular. And please consider how you can raise the bar in your respective personal and professional lives by working to develop strength of character, by striving to make a difference, and by contributing to the flourishing of teams, organizations, and communities. Our conversation this afternoon will be led by John Hentho, President and CEO of CBI Health, Canada's largest integrated community healthcare services network. He also serves as the board chair of Live Labs, Canada's leading provider of laboratory diagnostic information and digital health connectivity systems. John has deep expertise and experience in the healthcare sector. He follows his passion for business creation in Canada as a coach and mentor to entrepreneurs and developing executives. And importantly, he serves on the council of the E&O Inatowicz Institute for Leadership. And so, it is with great pleasure and deep gratitude that I now turn things over to our moderator, John Hentho.
Thank you, Gerard. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm so pleased to welcome our panelists as well. We have so much to discuss, to explore about leadership in the pandemic, particularly through the lens of healthcare. Before I begin, and I say this on behalf of all the leaders that are in the panel, and I'm sure I speak for all of them when I say that it's also important to recognize and acknowledge the literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of our front care staff and professionals across the full spectrum that continue to support Canadians in their health needs through this pandemic. They continue to do so. I think we've run out of the right words to say in terms of our gratitude, but we are grateful for what they bring every day in terms of their dedication, their compassion, their skill, and resilience for what they do. And I, for one, continue to be inspired every day by our team and what they do, and I'm grateful for it. So with that, let's get going on the conversation around healthcare under siege and the role of leadership. And specifically, we're going to talk a lot about leader character. And really, when we talk about leadership at Ivey, we talk about things like the importance of competence, commitment, and character. And while there's lots to be written on about competence and commitment, not enough has been spoken about character, which is where the Institute spends its time, and the way ultimately it is our character that informs our judgment, our decision-making, the actions that we take. And I'm looking forward to learning today from our panelists what they have done around taking those character elements, if you will, and apply them to the judgment of navigating through the most remarkable crisis of our generation. So with that, I'm not going to spend time on introductions because I want to get right to the substance of it. We have lots of write-ups on the website if you want to learn more about these really remarkable leaders. But let me begin with this, and I'm going to ask Georgina Black to take the first question, if you will. And so, Georgina, you and I have had a lot of conversations over the last 14 months, and as a managing partner for Deloitte Canada, I think you're in one of the most unique positions. You've got this broad perspective of the healthcare system. You've been engaged across the country. You were already working on transformational work to begin with, and then the pandemic happens, and even your own team has been pressed into action to support and solve like direct pandemic challenges. And so for you, the first question is this, which is, what have been your takeaways from leadership and action that you've observed from the sector? What were those standout moments of success and failure that maybe even caused you to reflect on even your own leadership contributions?
Yeah, thanks, John. You're right. I do have a very unique and privileged position working across the country and frankly in other jurisdictions. So as I reflected on the types of leadership I've seen during this pandemic, I really grouped it into three types of leaders. So let me take you through that. The first group of leaders that I saw were what I'll call the traditionalists. So these were the leaders who in the moment of the crisis really tried to rely on the traditional rules, systems, relationships. They were the leaders who naturally wanted to control information. They weren't transparent, and they really led with a scarcity mentality. They didn't embrace the science, and I saw it as they were fortifying behind kind of the bricks and mortar and actually heightening fear and panic. There are examples, obviously I'm not going to name organizations, but we saw hospital leaders hoarding personal protective equipment, while their very close partners in home care or long-term care were like watching recycling supplies. We saw long-term care organizations paralyzed in their response, and they shut down their communication with families, governments. Some governments were opaque with information. So these types of what I'll call sort of traditionalist leaders did not perform well. And then there's the second group, John, which I will call the integrators. This was the majority of leaders that I saw in health systems. They're the leaders who moved into action right away to deal with the immediate issues. They set up right away cross-functional, cross-organizational teams to share information. They collaborated, they flexed the rules, they embraced the science and data. They shared supplies, they procured together, they problem solved together. And they really were focused on a shared common goal. They did their best to be transparent and to communicate, but mostly these organizations worked within their current ecosystem. So they already had partnerships in place. So it was a fairly easy muscle. They didn't adjust well to new partners coming in. And so then the third group of leaders, type of leadership that I saw was, I'll call them the pioneers. And so these were the leaders who not only worked to solve the immediate crisis, but they also took the longer term view. They really seized this moment to accelerate change, to frankly move into the future. Yeah, they embraced virtual care. They collaborated with unusual partners such as retailers, telcos, call centers, organizations who weren't in their sort of ecosystem to begin with. These leaders started to invest in creating a digitally literate workforce. They accelerated all of their digital tech programs underway, and they were really transparent with information and effective with communication. These leaders, very interestingly, also responded real time to gaps they had in addressing equity and access and focusing on diverse and vulnerable populations. So they were able to move quickly. These leaders advocated for their workforces. They advanced pay equity. They took a leader's eat last mentality. They paid themselves last. They cared for their staff. And they really also at the same time tried to focus on a brighter future. So just to wrap that up, thinking about those three kind of leadership archetypes I just described, traditionalists, integrators, pioneers, I look at that against some global research that we did across all industries to really understand what are the leadership characteristics that differentiated organizations who significantly outperformed their peers during this crisis. So this is government, healthcare, private providers globally. And there were 5 characteristics. The leaders were prepared. They'd worked through scenario planning in the past. They were adaptable and flexible. They were collaborative. They focused on being trustworthy, and they were really authentic leaders. And so back to my archetypes, the traditionalist leaders didn't have any of those, exhibit any of those characteristics. The integrators mostly demonstrated being adaptable, collaborative, mostly trustworthy, although I'd say I was still shocked at the amount of self-interest I saw, especially when it came to scarce resources. And they advocated for their workforces. The thing with the integrators is they weren't as well prepared as they could have been, because healthcare, governments, and hospitals have really cut back on investing in planning and scenario planning. And then the pioneers actually demonstrated all of those traits, being prepared, adaptable, collaborative, trustworthy, and authentic. So those are some, I think, interesting kind of archetypes and learnings from across the country.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that one, Georgina. Dr. Verna, you are President and CEO of Alberta Health Services, which, for those that do not know, is one of the largest employers in Canada with over 100,000 employees. And you serve all Albertans, so more than 4.2 million Albertans. And what strikes me is just the complexity of that organization. And if you could share some of your leadership insights into how you navigated through the pandemic across the complexity of the frontline healthcare services that your organization provides, and how it evolved, and maybe along the way, what surprised you, and what course corrections that you had to take as a leader to help navigate through this, completely uncertain future that the pandemic placed to us.
Great, thanks very much, John, for that question. I think I'm tired just actually trying to think about how to answer it, but just say that, healthcare is really a person-to-person business, right? And even though AHS seems to be all-encompassing, at the end of the day, it is person-to-person, frontline care delivery, and that's what we need to keep in mind. So my job in leading this provincialized integrated healthcare system is to really make sure that those frontline trusting relationships are continued with the least amount of issues or obstacles during the pandemic. I think one of the key attributes that's really enabled us to be able to respond to the pandemic is that in Alberta, we've actually been dealing with natural disasters about every 2 to 3 years since AHS was formed about 11 years ago. We went from H1N1 in 2009, we had Slave Lake Fire in 2011, Southern Alberta floods in 2013, Fort Mac wildfire in 2016, and now the pandemic in 2020. I'm just waiting for the pestilence to come at some point. But, with each of these natural disasters, we have had hundreds of learnings each time. And it really has helped us to be adapting our emergency management system to be at the best when the pandemic started. So really helped us build what I would call our organizational resiliency, which is really our ability to anticipate, to prepare, to respond to, and adapt to changes to sudden disruptions. And this type of resiliency not only requires leadership, as we know, but also people, the right processes, and obviously healthcare delivery. The one thing that really surprised us a bit in terms of over the course of the pandemic is that if you can imagine the types of disasters that I listed, they were fairly local in certain parts of the province. So for example, the Slave Lake wildfire was, in the Slave Lake region. Fort Mac is in the northeast part of the province. And our structures are really based on localized disasters so that we actually can keep the rest of the organization whole, so that we can deliver healthcare where we need to, and then have a certain part of the management structure really be used to sort of deal with that particular part. But about 2 months into the pandemic, we realized that the COVID-19, compared to everything else, is all consuming for us. It took over the entire province, all parts of the organization. So one of the things that we had to do was evolve and change some of our structures and processes to really recognize the pervasiveness and the relentless nature of the pandemic. So that was actually really important for us to recognize. And so we've now developed sort of different groups, different communities, different processes to really make sure that the whole organization is connected And obviously this then connects to our board and as well as to government. In terms of leadership approaches and anything that's been different for us, I think one of the major things that we really focused on, I'm going to talk a little bit more about at another question, is really about the importance of communications. Because really effective communications really needs you to be honest, open, and very timely, because things change so quickly in COVID, and was really central to really ensuring that our staff stayed informed and engaged and supported. And again, the nimbleness, being able to adapt in very, very quick real time was also something that we really had to move forward on. And so really when it comes to leadership approaches, were there any things that was different for me? Probably not a lot, but just to recognize that we are always learning through this. Really important to support our teams, really important to emphasize the importance of self-care, self-compassion to make sure that we're all resilient. And then ultimately, you just need to trust yourself, your teams and your staff, and know that everyone is doing their best under challenging times.
Verna, that's excellent. It's a great reminder that you've been through, and it's a terrible term for it, many fire drills beforehand to kind of build that in there. The difference, of course, being 14 months is a long time and counting on this one. So thank you for that insight. To Heather Chalmers, who, Heather, as president and CEO of both GE Canada and president of GE Healthcare Canada, where you spent 14 years of your career before ascending also to the GE Canada CEO role. You've had a unique position here, and you and I have talked about this, and it's quite interesting. You lead this large organization that was impacted by the pandemic in incredibly different ways. Like, most organizations either, swelled, suffered, there's some uniformity to it, but you're a pretty diverse company. And so you've had some parts of your organization, those, for example, that would serve the airline industry, that faced huge headwinds, no pun intended, while others were pressed to capacity in some areas, for example, in your healthcare segments. And so it makes it a challenge for a leader to try to manage that almost the paradox of what's going on inside of the organization. So can you comment a little bit about those leadership challenges and how to build the sense of what does one team mean in this imbalanced impact of the pandemic, and further, maybe some level of shine a light a bit on maybe how this maybe evolved over the course of the pandemic or continues to evolve?
Sure. First, I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to participate today. It's wonderful to be amongst this group of leaders. I've already written down a ton of notes, so I'm learning as we go here. So thank you. You are right. GE, we do play in a number of industries, and for the audience, it's power, renewables, aviation, healthcare, as were mentioned. And during the pandemic, each of them were considered as essential, but they were impacted in very dramatically different ways. However, I would say there was a number of things that were systemic in terms of the leadership needs, and perhaps I'll just share a couple of them for today's discussion. The first one was we created a GE Canada crisis team. Not much different than what you mentioned, Werner and Georgina. And while it may be the traditionalists or integrators, but it was really necessary in the moment to have a cross-functional group inclusive of legal, environmental health and safety, medical directors, myself, government affairs, to make decisions on behalf of the entire GE Canada organization. And those decisions required that cross-functional expertise almost every single time. The second thing that I thought was really important was that we were able to provide a Canada lens or a context to those decisions. As a multinational organization, you can imagine a number of our employees and businesses report into the US or they're reporting globally. And we had to act on behalf of our employees and our businesses in their on the ground context, which in a lot of cases was very different to others. Case in point right now, with where we are in Ontario and the vaccine situation, I can tell you, my US counterparts are already flying and going to visit customers, which is very, unique and separate to what we're seeing here. And the third thing, and this builds on what you said, Verna, you actually couldn't over communicate. When things first started to unfold, we were having weekly and twice a week calls with all of our people leaders or people managers across the businesses. And that gave them the opportunity to ask us questions real time. That two-way communication was so important to give them the confidence that we had their backs and we were supporting them. When I fast forward 1 year later, and John, you and I have talked about this, there's very little, I would say, crisis management that's happening right now, that reactive crisis management. And so much so that I'm finding out I'm having to unwind that command and control operating culture and almost remind these leaders, these managers that we have, that they can trust their judgment again. Like, they can trust their judgment. They have the tools and skills and the autonomy to make decisions, almost giving them confidence to be who they were pre-pandemic. So an interesting experiment in social behavior, I don't know, but something that we're going through as we speak.
Thanks. It's a great reminder, because I think we all feel like we're still going through triage and we're trying to unlearn how do we get back out of that to get to a different cadence of business and conversations. And part of it is that we're still all behind screens, and that just getting back to the same office building may change things up. So I'll look forward to that as well. So thank you, Heather, on this one. Melissa, you and I have the distinction of starting our jobs the same month in 2019. You know, going into the role as president of St. Joseph's Healthcare Hamilton. I remember you and I first met, our first and last in-person meeting actually was in December of that year. And we were both actually exchanging notes about just the leadership journey that we were actually on. And it was early days. You know, neither of us knew at that time that was going to be it and everything was going to change. And so for you, I think many would be really interested. You came into this new role, you had like 9 months underneath you when, of course, this full-scale pandemic comes into full force and uproots pretty much every part of the agenda you thought you had as a leader going into it. So if you could kind of share with us kind of how the pandemic impacted your leadership journey, leadership agenda at St. Joe's, and you know, what kind of course corrections did you have to do on the approach?
Yeah, thank you so much. Such a great question. There's probably a couple things that I would highlight in particular, and maybe I should just start by saying the same thing that Heather did. I just feel so grateful to be on this panel with this amazing group of leaders, yourself included, John. So this is just such a terrific opportunity, and so thankful to be here. You know, one thing that I would just say before I even talk about the pandemic is that I was changing jobs from working in government for 15 years and then transitioning into you know, really an operational role of running and operating a hospital, long-term care, and home care. And in my own mind, I thought, oh, I hope I have the skill set in order to be successful in doing this big transition that I'm moving to. Might know a lot about what's happening in hospitals, but I don't have the deep clinical knowledge. I'm not a clinician by background. And I had 15 years of growing up inside government, so I knew the ins and outs of it and the processes and felt very confident in the way in which I was taking decisions forward and making those decisions and acting as a leader. And I think, you know, the first thing that I learned, not even learned, but the first thing that I really came into this job knowing and understanding was that I needed to rely on the people who really have the deep clinical knowledge and the expertise of actually functioning in the organization, and really valuing that in all of the decision making and actually setting up structures to make sure that I'm getting the right input and the feedback as the leader in order to ensure that we're making the right choices and right decisions. And, you know, the other thing that I would just say, so that, I mean, that was before the pandemic. And then of course, the pandemic hits, you know, it's 9 months, 10 months into my time here at St. Joe's. And personally, I would just say I felt so grateful that I at least had some time inside the organization to do things in a normal, you know, semi-normal way. You know, we were able to launch a new strategic plan before the pandemic hit. You know, we're doing a reassessment of that strategic plan, as you can appreciate right now. But also let me get out to the teams and see everybody before we ended up moving everything virtually. Although, of course, I'm still in the building, and also to do some really important recruitments that were important before we hit the pandemic too. Then the pandemic hit, so at least I know people, know who the team is. I think that was really important and quite valuable. But when the pandemic hit, it just changes your whole leadership style too. And I know you've heard a little bit about this from Verna and Heather and Georgina too, but to me, the expectation of someone who's in a role like this is that I'm constantly thinking about the future. And what I felt that I had to change, and I know everyone around this table is feeling the same, is I had to think fast and slow at the same time. And that isn't normally how you would function. You're often thinking about, okay, so 3 years out, what's the strategic vision here that we have as an organization? But during the pandemic, there's moments where we're thinking about, there's a big change that needs to be implemented tomorrow, and how are we going to get that implemented right away? Or actually right away we need to change this because the PPE, something's changed or adjusted in the PPE world. That's how it felt when we first got into it. So for me, it was that shift in leadership. And I think what Heather was just talking about is so important, because it really made everybody kind of stop and pause and start thinking about the immediate. And I've tried my hardest to make sure that I'm not just thinking about the immediate, that constantly thinking, as I mentioned, it's the fast and slow, like what do we need to be thinking about today? But what I love that idea too, Georgina, that you were just talking about in terms of the pioneers, also thinking about what are the opportunities during the pandemic that we can capitalize on in a positive way to help move the agenda forward. That really is a good agenda for us to be thinking about, the virtual care opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So that just became really important, and just trying our very best, trying myself to be 2 steps ahead, even when you don't actually know how exactly those 2 steps are going to be. And I think, looking back, there's times when we did a great job of that as a team, and there's obviously times when we didn't, but I think we did it more often than not. So I'm pretty proud of what we've been able to accomplish this past year.
Thank you so much. There's probably a book in there somewhere on just the amount of change that you had to go through in the last 24 months now, as you've kind of passed your 2 years on the job mark. I'd like to just switch gears here a little bit, and I'm going to pick up a little bit on the reflection idea, and just as you described it, I think, Melissa, and this one's for Georgina, which is, the pandemic has provided us all with an opportunity to reflect personally and professionally, and of course, as leaders. We would all agree that reflection is kind of a key ingredient in terms of our personal development as leaders, just being able to kind of look back on things. But I'm interested, Georgina, in, what are the 1 or 2 hard-won insights on leadership that you have learned through the pandemic that you actually wish you could go back and tell yourself, March of last year, and say, hey, this is going to happen. You need to know a few things before this thing goes, because it's going to go on for a long time.
Advice to my younger self?
Well, it is that question, but in a better way.
Don't start watching 90 Day Fiancé. No, on a serious note, I've thought a lot about this, John. The first thing I would tell myself, and Verna used this language already, is that self-care is not a luxury. Right. So this is really quite personal for me. I don't mind sharing. I abandoned a long-standing practice I have. It's a morning routine of exercise, meditation, journaling. I know this practice makes me a better leader, a better person, but it felt indulgent, honestly, to do this for myself when there was so much urgent work to do. We just could not provide enough support to our clients. It was truly felt 24/7. I'm on leadership team at Deloitte, and we were doing scenario planning ourselves, and some of the scenario plans early days were pretty grim, and then you're worried about what that means for your teams. And the essential caregiver to my mom, who's 92, has Alzheimer's. It's a dreadful period of time for seniors, and as a caregiver, very stressful. And then of course you're trying to keep your family together and keep them cheerful. So I abandoned that practice, and I went down a slippery slope, and I trust I'm not the only person on the phone who may have had too much wine on an evening, or got into 90 Day Fiancé, and maybe eating too many chips. But I share that because there was anxiety that set in, of feeling not in control. I felt, my family said to me, why are you watching the news all the time? I felt I had to watch news 24/7 because a client would call me at 10 o'clock at night, something had happened, and I needed to be there. So it was a bad spiral. Fortunately, I have the history of good habits, and I knew how. I came to a point where, okay, I got to hit the reset button so that I can fill my cup so I can be great for my family, my clients, my team, and so forth. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would tell myself, and this will be shorter, is to protect unscheduled time in my calendar. And this is very important because and Melissa, you touched on this, we need to spend time on important non-urgent work, which is mostly about people. And this culture of Zoom, when you meet with someone on Zoom, it doesn't mean you've actually had a meaningful conversation or a meaningful connection. And so I've now set aside time where I will meet with people and they drive the agenda. And people need this connection outside the agenda-driven Zoom meetings. And the other thing I was a bit late on realizing is all the advances we had made around diversity and inclusion in a meeting room, in a boardroom. I think we lost that on Zoom, John. I noticed that women and diverse leaders engage differently than men do on Zoom. And so I've developed a practice now to look for ways to engage them. So those are the two things, actually being a bit more deliberate about time, unscheduled time to be a good leader, engage people, and then self-care is not a luxury.
Thank you. Listen, thank you so much for sharing that. And thanks for the personal share as well, Georgina. I think it's important for other leaders to hear that journey. We often as leaders have to carry a load that sometimes we feel that we have to be the invulnerable rather than the vulnerable. And I think it's exactly the opposite of that. So Verna, over to you. Kind of the same question. And I'll let you handle it either similarly, but I'll add the other twist of saying, in addition to all of those insights, but what was the biggest challenge in the pandemic that you've had to overcome so far as a leader of AHS?
Like I said, I think I only have a minute or so, John, but I think the biggest challenge for us, running a healthcare system like I do is been the speed in which change has been occurring and how new evidence is coming out every day, and how do we adapt to that? How do we actually work together? We pride ourselves in being one of the most integrated healthcare systems, definitely within Canada, and I think in the top 5 globally. But that after saying that, we still have to work at it. And I think what COVID has done is really uncovered all the necessary partnerships that we need to do in order to be able to deliver. So let me give you some examples. When I think about lab testing, and when we started at the beginning of the pandemic, our lab teams, we have a wholly owned subsidiary, and our lab team started in January to develop the recipe to test for COVID because there was nothing, as you know, John, there was nothing actually there for testing for COVID. So we were ready. Got our first case on March the 5th, and we were doing about 35 tests per day to start. We actually had to go up to we're now doing about 22,000 tests per day. But it really required a combination of work from our wholly owned sub, from public health, from our capital management team, our IT, HR, communications, operations. I mean, it was everybody in to deliver the product. Contact tracers, we know what a challenge has been across the country for contact tracers. Pre-pandemic for the province, we had 50 contact tracers. Right now, I've got about 3,000 contact tracers, and we can manage about 4,900 positive cases per day. So again, what did that require? It required a whole team approach of everybody was working together to be able to deliver on that. PPE, supply chain was such a critical issue in the spring of last year. Again, took everybody to be at the table. Making informed decisions. We developed a scientific advisory group from many disciplines to provide us with evidence-based recommendations, because there were so many questions that were coming up. So I think at the end of the day, essentially our biggest challenge is also the test of our biggest strength, which is our integration, our ability to work well together. And creating that culture over the last 5 years in this role has been absolutely a positive journey in my mind. But the pandemic really tested us. And I think at least in Alberta, I'm really proud to say that I think we passed a test, and hopefully continuing to pass the test as soon as we can get over the test.
Right, exactly. And I appreciate the comments about scaling, because I hadn't really, you raised an interesting point in your organization. When you do something, you have to make this thing scale quickly to meet the needs of all Albertans. And I don't think I fully appreciated that. So thank you for that as well. I think the word of the pandemic that comes closest to the heart of it for me has been resilience. And I don't think it's a word I used a lot before, but it became kind of our mantra, our goal for many leaders was how do we build organizational, resilience. And so for you, Heather, this was important for you and for your organization. So if you could, perhaps share with us, how you remain determined, resilient, confident, in spite of the challenges that the pandemic presented to you, and how you kind of move that into the organization.
So I'll be honest, there were moments of weakness, vulnerability. You've heard a couple examples, but I will confess to being an optimist, but at heart, and I truly believe in the power of reframing. So very early on, what just really touched me was how many employees use this opportunity to innovate, to creatively destruct how we have, quote unquote, always done things. And it was inspiring. And I made sure that those stories where we took processes and plants and had to adjust them to ensure we were physically distancing, but still getting the same level of productivity. We shared those stories so that there was a sense of pride in the organization. In our healthcare division, as an example, we, in our headquarters office, which we had to close down, we were able to convert all of the meeting rooms into virtual studios so that we could connect and train clinicians across the country on the very equipment that they needed in order to fight the pandemic. We also launched an e-commerce platform. So, and these are things now that I'm finding they're way more effective, productive, and specific to the needs of our customers. And it's something that we want to hardwire in for the long term. When I think more broadly across GE in Canada, COVID has exposed the fragility of supply chains. And you're going to see a reorganization of supply chains all over the world. They're calling it globalization. You're also you've heard it, our own federal budget, a lot of stimulus dollars are going to be spent. And in our case, it's very much targeted towards the energy transition. I would argue that Canada is in a terrific position to harness those opportunities and play a leadership role. I would also argue that GE in Canada has a terrific opportunity to be a partner. And so you say, well, this has nothing, what does this have to do with the discussion? And I think the point is here, as a leader or as an organization, you can face a crisis and you can retract and you can look inward and get very, very defensive. Or you can be, as Georgina called, that pioneer, and you can lean in and you can embrace it and look for opportunities that will provide meaningful growth for the short and the long term. And knock on wood, I hope we're on the right path and the latter path.
Thank you. Thanks for that one. Melissa, courage and accountability are obviously important to, individuals, teams, organizational success. And it's certainly something that we all needed in the last 14 months. And so I want to know, for your perspective, maybe it was already ready-made, but how did you develop courage? And more importantly, how did you learn to embrace accountability in this incredibly fluid, high volatile world where every one of your words and actions are watched, evaluated, and commented on?
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, I guess there's a few things that I would say. I feel, and I'm sure others may actually have comments on this point that you're raising here too, John. I mean, one thing that I would just say is, for me, as we've moved into the pandemic, before the pandemic, it was easier to really think about that speech and really, practice and have some commentary in advance and work with people. But we just haven't had the luxury of that. And I think just being brave and being the kind of leader who is willing to be out there and rally the troops, because I think a point that's really important in terms of the context for which I've been living the last 14 months is our workforce are essential workers. They're in the hospital every day or out in home care or working in long-term care every day. And they don't have the luxury of being able to work from home. Many of them don't have the luxury of working from home. And we're putting, at certain periods of time this last 14 months, we're putting these people at risk, and that has weighed really heavily. And to me, it became very, very important, not just me, of course, the entire team, for us to be very transparent with the team through town halls that we were doing at times, 2 to 3 times. I'm sure Verna was doing the same, doing these town halls where we just had to answer any question they had as best as we possibly can, bring the experts with you, whatever. But really, really important to be acknowledging what we're asking this workforce to do and supporting them as much as we possibly can throughout the entire period. And I would say when we first started in March, like, I think we all just had this opinion that, oh, it'll be short. I don't know why, but we can just rally in a couple months. Well, and then it goes on, and there's waves to it. And we have asked our team to do extraordinary work, which we're so incredibly proud of, but it has taken a personal toll on them, and not just the toll of what's happening. Like, don't forget, it's all about what's happening in their environments, but also at work. So for me, it was the values of transparency and being open and actually rallying this group of essential workers that just became more important than saying the perfect thing or doing the perfect thing. It became more important to be open and them see that we're the kind of leadership team that will listen to them and that will make adjustments based on what we hear from them. I think those were the points I would say.
Thank you so much on this one. I'm going to actually come back to Verna on this, because it kind of leads to a conversation around the importance of building and retaining trust as kind of a core part of leadership. And, Verna, as a senior leader, representing, this important organization, what have you done in the last year? And maybe more of it, but maybe it's building on past successes, but what have you done to kind of contribute to the notion and to the effort of building trust, both internally amongst your own team members, but also in the general public, because there's a sharp lens, obviously, on AHS and every activity that you have. And so any comments that you may have on the importance of kind of building and retaining trust?
Yeah, so as we know, trust is hard to build and easy to dissolve, right? And so it really has taken us a long time to actually get trust of Albertans. We've did some polling of how Albertans view AHS prior to the pandemic, and no question, 90+% of Albertans knows that they get good care when they come into AHS, and they have confidence in the organization. So we're starting from a good place, I would say. We often do get confused with government, which is not necessarily a good thing, because as we know, governments aren't necessarily trusted. And so we have to be particularly purposeful around making people understand that we, in fact, are the delivery agent and not, a government. Well, we are part of government in the context, we're an agency, but we're not government in the strictest sense. I think it's really important that part of trust, to be able to really establish it, is to really link honesty and transparency with it, right? You can't have one without the other. And so I think it's really important that when we share information, we do it in a timely fashion, we do it respectfully, and we do it putting the data out there so that people can hear what the truth is out there. And so I think that's how we've been really trying hard. We've been using social media, obviously. We have a lot of stories. Data is only goes so far, and data doesn't get to the heart of what people really want to feel about healthcare. And so we feature frontline providers. We had a very impactful tweet. We have obviously got an AHS Twitter post, but one of it actually showed an ICU physician who was sort of kneeling on one knee in front of a desk with his head kind of down like this, and he was about to give bad news to an Albertan who was dying of COVID. And we got so much feedback on that photo alone and it just brought out the emotions of people. And I think trusting the fact that, at the end of the day, everyone is trying their best. They're working their heart out, every part of our organization. And I've always said to our teams that, I don't really care if you touch a patient or not. Everybody has a link to a patient, whether it's direct or indirect. Because I really needed the back office functions to feel as empowered in making differences as we note with supply chain. Honestly, if we didn't have the right supply chains in Alberta, we would have been up the creek, last year. And so really trying to make that connection, but make that connection at a very personal level. And then very importantly, we did a lot of work around communications. We had daily newsletters that went out to now weekly. We did video interviews with our teams that are touching different parts of the pandemic, but we always end on the positive. We always end on what we're hearing from the public, because we knew that internally we have to keep our teams motivated. And that type of commendation and feedback is what keeps anybody in healthcare going. And so, really adding to, we're lucky because we have resilient staff. They are resilient to begin with. That's how you end up in healthcare, but you have to build on it, and you can't let the pandemic wear it down. And so, those types of activities has really been, we've been really working hard at, both internally and externally, trying to maintain that trust.
Thank you. Thanks, Brenda. Thank you. And I do remember the tweet that you were referring to, and it is important. And we've seen this across all the organizations on storytelling, because we can get lost in either the statistics for the day, but we need to connect to the stories, particularly as we try to support the frontline folks that kind of get the job done day in and day out. And I do appreciate the comment about everyone in the organization has a contribution to make, whether they touch the patient or not. And I think that is it's a good reminder of gratitude for a big, broader team as well. Melissa, I want to talk a little bit, change the subject a little bit here, but not to get too heavy, but the pandemic, of course, isn't just a health challenge. It's actually a humanitarian challenge, because it's impacted us all so profoundly in our personal lives, not just what's going on inside of our day-to-day jobs and our responsibilities. But part of this is a reminder that leaders have to show good judgment, and good judgment comes in a number of different ways. But ultimately, we would all agree, and you've actually talked about some of this, particularly when you mentioned you referenced the fact that you're sometimes having to kind of move on the fly with new information all the time. So, leaders with good judgment show flexibility when confronted with new information and new situations. And that sounds like exactly like you went through. And so what did you have to do to kind of activate and demonstrate good judgment in these situations? And how did you kind of deploy that even with your team?
Yeah, and I'm sure others may want to comment on this too, because I know they likely set up similar kinds of structures, but certainly within the healthcare system, a common structure that is often used is the IMS structure, and creating some kind of command table, which we, immediately struck last year. And they're actually usually, and I mean, Verna was kind of talking about this, like if you're dealing with a normal kind of crisis or disaster, you can put an IMS structure in place, and it's kind of there for a week. You get through the issue and then you move on and you're back to your regular structures. Heather was talking about this too, where our need to create the command table, it's actually lived well beyond its usual time frame. And we actually had to evolve the approach that we take, because it really has been, it's developed for those, short-term temporary kind of issues. And for me anyway, the structure that we ended up putting in place, we had to put processes around, really important processes, like making sure that we're really documenting the recommendations that are coming forward, but also making sure we have the right experts that are sitting at our command table who can give us the best possible information that we can gather at that moment before, a fundamental decision has to be made. I think as leaders, the other challenge we've all had in the last 14 months is that some decisions do actually need to be made quickly and urgently with very little information. There are other decisions that you could actually take more time to develop and really consider. And I think that's always the delicate balance that we're all playing, is to make sure that you're kind of doing that the most effective way possible. I think for me, really listening to the experts became absolutely fundamental, and we would actually shift in and out some of those experts over time. That it evolved who we actually needed to have sitting around the table, who's been supporting us from a command perspective. But, we've made decisions to pay, for sick time for our staff, even though that's not a provincial priority. We made decisions to buy PPE and actually share that PPE with others, to Georgina's point earlier, never knowing whether or not it was going to be reimbursed. Certainly at the beginning of this, we had no idea what was going to happen. Like, some of this took some courage, but I think really we had to listen, and you got to listen to the experts and use the best advice you can. I don't know if anyone else wants to make a comment, but that would be my perspective on this for sure. And I think we're all kind of seeing how others are getting judged in terms of their judgments. And I don't think anyone can be perfect in a pandemic, but it's taken a lot of effort to really make sure that we're just listening to the best possible advice you can, using your gut in the decision making to support the team who's on the ground and on the front line working in this environment.
Thanks for that. I'm gonna build on that one because it's an interesting area, and it really speaks to this throughout the pandemic. I think we would all agree on this, that the information, to your point, Melissa, it's coming quickly, it's sometimes conflicting or it's unavailable. Sometimes it's even false, which makes our jobs even harder at times. And this question's for Heather, and it really speaks to around, the importance of having a team that's prepared to share information with you, to have the courage to be both candid and transparent when they're providing feedback, even though they're going to tell the boss something that they need to hear but don't want to hear. And so to you, Heather, as a leader, how do you create that environment where candor and transparency is not just welcomed, but encouraged or even demanded?
It's a great question, and it's a very easy trap to fall into if you don't take it head on. Certainly as a leader in my direct reports, that's my style. However, to my earlier point, I'm very aware that you can quickly always get a sanitized version of what's going on. So even prior to the pandemic, I have two things that I use as a sounding board, a litmus test to kind of get a pulse of what's really going on in the organization. The first one is, I call it my True North team, and it's in the healthcare business. And it's probably 8 or 9 employees from across the country, different functions, all levels of the organization, but certainly not my direct reports. And we meet on a monthly basis, and the agendas are very fluid, but I use them to discuss things that we're going, that are topical, things that we may be rolling out or have rolled out, to get their feedback, to pulse them, to understand what's, the water cooler talk, and to understand how communications are getting received. And that was very important in COVID. Even very well-intentioned, thought out communications could be misconstrued. And so I can't tell you how helpful it was and continues to be to have this team available. And what they get from me is an unsanitized version of what's really happening at the highest levels of the organization. They also get to network with one another that perhaps otherwise they wouldn't know each other in the regular course of business. The other one, which is newer, is we created this Inclusion Diversity Advisory Council, IDEC, and they report into the GE Canada board. And their role is to promote inclusion, diversity, and belonging within GE Canada. So in that same vein, they provide feedback to the board. We have the resources to do things, and they represent the voices of the employees. So just 2 examples. They have been, as a leader, I have learned so much from them. And I would encourage, if you don't have anything like that in place, it might be something to consider. It's simple to do.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And I'm going to switch gears here and talk about the future. And but before I do, I want to thank you for the candid conversations that we're having around leadership, the challenges of leadership through a pandemic. It never came with a playbook for any of us, and so a lot of it is on invention. And like Heather, in your first comment, which is I'm taking lots of notes. I'll look forward to replaying this and take more notes. But there were a lot of lessons learned on this one, and this is where I want to shift gears. I want to talk about the future of healthcare. And so I'm going to set it up this way, and I'm going to ask Georgina to lead the conversation and others to weigh in. And it's pretty broad. So, and I'll accept that I'm relatively new to the healthcare side, and so I won't be as informed as you, but I will say this, that my observation was healthcare across Canada was clearly already under review and transformation prior to the pandemic in various stages, sometimes in writing and white papers, sometimes actually structurally moving in that direction, but with good intentions, but maybe not the right speed. The impact of the pandemic, I think we would all agree, exposed pretty deep systemic deficiencies in the system. And on top of that, new challenges that we had not seen before, beyond the obvious ones we already saw around an aging population, the demographics working against the system kind of stuff, to things like now significant backlogs in what is terribly termed elective surgery, and there's nothing elective about elective surgery. The delays in diagnosis and therefore treatment of critical illness, chronic illnesses, cancer. We were just coming to grips with understanding mental health and in the broader healthcare context when the tsunami is coming through us as a result of the pandemic impact that is creating a whole new set of demands on the system on mental health. And we don't even know what that's going to look like going forward. And when you couple that with other things, including the fact that our governments have now spent a lot of money to get us through this. And so government debt levels are going to be already at an all-time high, and are going to create different kind of constraints. And so against this backdrop, and Georgine, if you could lead this one, how would you frame the challenge for the future of healthcare in Canada? And what do you feel is necessary from healthcare leaders to meet that challenge?
So you framed up the challenge very nicely, John. Massive backlog. I would just emphasize we have a very fragile workforce. So before the pandemic, Canada had a shortage of health and social care workers. We also in this country haven't sorted out what we really think about social care workers, how we pay them, how we credentialize them, how they fit into the health and social care system if we think about it broadly. Your point around mental health and of course the financial challenges. So these are really unprecedented, I would say, for our country, and I don't think we really understand the magnitude of them yet. So clearly, health leaders are going to focus on immediate restoration of the healthcare system, right? To deal with the backlog and to, in a way, get back to business. And that's the right thing to do, but I'm deeply concerned about it, John, because all of our leaders and efforts risk going to system restoration.
Right.
And then we miss this once in a generation, I hope, opportunity to truly take advantage of the momentum and the innovation to actually move our health and social care system into the future. And so if this was all run by the private sector, we would likely set up a separate team, right? We'd have a team focused on system restoration, and we'd have a team focused on building out the future and getting there from here. So I think our first reaction would be, oh, well, we can't do that in healthcare because we don't have enough resources. And I think we need to ask the question, can we afford not to?
Okay.
We risk not moving it forward because the healthcare and social care system of the future is very different. The citizen's going to be at the center of it, powered by all the digital capabilities, the wearables, and so forth. The healthcare system is going to be powered by very sophisticated data and analytics, science, technology, and the health and social care ecosystem is going to look very different than it does today. We're already seeing telcos, insurance companies, retailers, tech companies. They should be more prevalent going forward. But if we revert back, are we going to be able to create that future dynamic system? Love to hear what the other leaders have to say about that.
Sure. Hey, Verna, do you want to weigh in on this?
I'm kind of chomping at the bit there, Georgina, when you threw the challenge out there. You know what? Healthcare post-COVID cannot be the same as healthcare pre-COVID. Cannot be. Too many people have passed away. There have been too many disasters in the pandemic, and we can't let that go to vain, right? And so we really do need to seize the moment and make sure that we maintain the momentum. You know, we had a virtual health strategy where we're looking at a 3-year roadmap to get us to where we want to be. You know, with the COVID, it took us 3 weeks to go from 10% ambulatory visits through virtual care to 90%. So there's no way we're going back to 10%. I can tell you that right now. Are we going to stay at 90%? I don't think so, not for most specialties, but we're going to be somewhere in the middle. But the onus is on us not to lose the momentum on all the positives. There's been some silver linings with COVID that we need to really engage on it. And the last point I just want to make is that, you know, it takes all of us in the sandbox to be part of the solution for healthcare. This is not just on healthcare providers to be the solutions. And one of the things that is really the pandemic has brought to the forefront is how literate people are around health with a pandemic. Canadians know about all the different B strains of the COVID virus, like go figure, right? They know which one is bad, which one is good. Would we have suspected they would have known that with influenza, right? We know that 20% of our emergency room visits are down consistently because, you know, our C task 4s and 5s, which are the ones that should be seen in family medicine clinics, are not going to emerge. Well, that should be maintained. So I think there's an opportunity to grasp and broaden health literacy amongst Canadians to help be part of the solution and have them drive their healthcare journey, and because that's where it should be. It shouldn't be driven by healthcare systems. And so I'd like to have that paradigm shift faster than later. But yeah, I absolutely, status quo is not an option. So totally agree with you, Georgina.
That's great. Melissa?
You know, I would definitely, I feel a similar sentiment to the two of you for sure. And even in my own mind, when I was thinking about what are all the challenges, I think I had the same list that everybody here had. You know, it's about retention, wellness, diversity, the patient needs, the consumer trends we're seeing, the financial crisis we see on the horizon, the innovation AI, the integration agenda. I think that's all certainly true. It feels like there's more opportunity though than there is challenge. And I love the way that Verna just put that to say, like, we can't go back to where we were before. We really have to be thinking about how we transform. The only thing that I would say though is the healthcare system is tired, and there is PTSD. There is PTSD, and there will be some lasting impact. We're deeply concerned about retention when it comes to the workforce. And so I think we're going to have to look for these innovative solutions anyway to support that workforce too. But we also have to just be careful, I think, about pace in terms of I love Georgina's idea. Like, it really should be another team. Wouldn't it be nice if it was a team that wasn't as tired as the team who was working on some of these other things at the moment too? Because that really, I think, is such a, and again, that's me just saying the immediate problem we have is even to think about ramping up services again. Remember, we just redeployed all of our staff who work in the ORs in Ontario anyway. All the staff who work normally on surgery, we redeployed the ones that could be to critical care. And then we want to pivot back to ramp up services. Like, we have these, you know, fundamental issues that we're going to have to address in terms of the people power to support the healthcare system moving forward. But again, there's more opportunity than there is challenge. I think there's more positivity than there is negativity in all of this. And I do totally agree that we just have to be willing to support the transform versus the let's stabilize everything and restore it to what it was before.
That's wonderful. Heather?
So I've made copious notes here, building a lot of them. You know, I'm going to build on what you've said. Certainly, I would say, without question, we need to continue the momentum in terms of virtual technologies, AI, data and analytics, integrated real-time data. That is going to help with the health human resource capacity challenges. There's no question. You talked about we don't need to see patients in the acute care settings all the time. There's better places to see them that are the function, frankly, more effective, and that's been started, and we need to continue that. What I would add that maybe hasn't been talked about is how do we do things at scale? And that's what COVID has shown that we have the capacity to do. Canada has we have a history of pilotitis when we adopt new innovative solutions, or not invented here. And I think COVID, while everyone is tired, it shows that when we want to change, we can do it, and we can do it with real momentum. So how do we hardwire that in some way? And in that vein, I think, John, you've heard me say this as well, that somehow we have to reframe our thinking about healthcare to begin with. It's over 50%, or in most cases, almost 50% of provincial budget spends. And we can continue to think about it as a cost versus how do we create economic value out of that? How do we adopt innovations that we've spent so much money to create in these accelerators or these startups? That is terrific, and yet we don't use it locally. So kind of reframing the entire healthcare model in some way, somehow, I think is a real opportunity. And then finally, I'll just end on that team. Melissa, you mentioned team and help, and everybody's going to be tired. And what I would say there's a lot of help. Like I know I'm industry, but we're not big bad industry. Like we're part of the healthcare system too. I use it, my kids use it. I think it's something that we all identify with as Canadians. So this team approach to trying to move us forward in a positive manner is going to be critical to success.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that too. I want to acknowledge that we have on the line watching you today quite a number of emerging leaders, and particularly that are in healthcare. They could be in a master's program, they could be in a number of things. And so I'm sure this has been incredibly invaluable for them, and they're going to be grateful for it. But no prompt on this question at all, but I want to take advantage of our last closing minutes here. And what advice would you have for these, based on what you said about the future of healthcare and what needs to be done? What advice would you give this generation of leaders that are coming through the system, who may be in late 20s, early 30s, or through 30s and 40s, that are looking to make that impact? And so what's the advice for emerging leaders in healthcare as you look post-pandemic? Who wants to take a shot at that?
So I would say be bold, be curious. And when you're told that's not possible, ask why not 25 times.
Thanks on that one.
The one I would just add is I think understanding, and I suspect the new leaders already have that, but really understanding, AI, digital analytics. Like there's a certain competency requirement that's just the ticket to the dance. You have to be very comfortable, because it's going to be integral to how care is delivered, both from a technology and at a system level.
Wonderful. Melissa?
I love all that. That's such great advice. I'm going to write that down for myself too. I think it's terrific. It's a good reminder for leaders, right? Be bold. So true. My advice would just be stay with it. I mean, honestly, healthcare is absolutely incredible. And I just remember when I first started and was an emerging leader myself, and it seems really complicated, and maybe there's other jobs that are easier. I'm not entirely sure, because it certainly turns into a 24/7 thing, but it is a vocation. Like, people who are in healthcare, they're in it because of the meaningfulness of it, and it really is incredible. And if you stick with it, if you stay in healthcare and there's all kinds of places you can work in healthcare. Look at all the leaders that you're seeing here. That's the other thing. Enormous amount of opportunity for emerging leaders. But if you stick with it, you can make material impact on people's real lives and real experiences. So it just is very valuable, and it's worth putting the time and energy into a career in healthcare, I'd say.
Wonderful. Good shout out for healthcare as a career thing. So we appreciate the reinforcement. It also speaks to all of our challenges on getting people to stay with it and come into the industry as well. Verna, for you.
Yeah, good advice from my three counterparts. And what I would say for emerging leaders, you really do have to just be very, very central to leadership competencies. Just make sure you have a strong foundation. Leadership awareness. If I had to list a fatal flaw, for people, upcoming leaders, is really that self-awareness piece. So really make sure that you land the foundations for leadership competencies really well. And when you're early in your career, it's very different than versus, myself in my current career where I am comfortable and I can say no. But early on, it's much harder to do that. And you're really trying to make your presence known. And so, be receptive, be open-minded, accept challenges that you may not think you can do. The imposter challenge, the imposter syndrome is here for all of us, not just yourselves. And so just stretch yourself. Don't never underestimate what you're capable of doing. And all the best to all of the up and coming leaders who are listening.
There's no chance that I'm going to summarize what I just heard for the last 70 minutes. So I'm not even going to attempt, because I will never get my notes right in this one. But I do want to say thank you so much to the four of you. To make time at a critical time that we're in right now, and just how challenging things are. And the fact of the matter is we are still in a pandemic. And yes, we're incredibly grateful for those that are continuing to kind of help us kind of work through this one. There's a great sense of optimism between the four of you on where things are. I share the optimism that light at the end of the tunnel is there. Everyone, please get their vaccine. Just kind of the critical end game on this one for us all. But the future is bright. It's not without its challenges, but I love the way you all framed it around the positivity of it and the impact it could have. And I think it gives lots of reason for optimism going forward for the healthcare sector in general. And I encourage the partnerships that are more unconventional in there as well. And because I think there's just so many voices now into healthcare that weren't there before, because we weren't in a pandemic where everyone knew everything about healthcare and everyone's an expert. But you know what? There's some good innovation ideas from places that are unconventional, and I think we should take advantage of it. So with that, thank you all so much. I'm going to pass it back over to Gerard for any final comments, and wish you all the very best. And thanks again for your time today. Gerard, over to you.
Thank you, John. And John, I echo those words. I thought it was a great conversation, a rich conversation. And quite frankly, I think we could have continued the conversation, in particular when people bring up this notion around the imposter syndrome, which is always really interesting to talk about. So John, thank you. And thank you to Georgina, Heather, Melissa, and Verna for a great session and sharing your hard-won insights. You certainly gave us lots to reflect on. To our audience, thank you for tuning in, and I hope you are inspired and invigorated and compelled to initiate action. And so we look forward to seeing you at our next session, scheduled for June the 3rd, on corporate leadership in an era of transformation. We'll send you a link for registration to that event in a follow-up email. But of course, you can always check us out via our website at ivey.ca/leadership. And so for now, enjoy the rest of the day. Stay safe, remain well. Bye now.